On this week's Lazy Sunday upload, once again, is Jonathan Haidt. In my opinion, Haidt is one of the most important voices around when it comes to understanding the causes of what's happening on US college campuses today, and for warning about the potential consequences of the increasing political divide in the United States. This clip is cut from a longer interview with Nick Gillespie of Reason TV, link below. Incidentally, Nick Gillespie will be one of the speakers at this year's Friedman Liberty Conference in Sydney, held at the end of April, which I will be both attending and participating in a panel discussion, the details of which are still being worked out. Anyway, if you're interested in that conference, check out the link below. But for now, here's Jonathan Haidt.
So this is all so new. There's been, I believe, a kind of a moral revolution, a new moral culture emerging on campus. But it really is only in the last 2 years. So if any of your viewers graduated from college in 2013, they probably haven't seen it. So there was a kind of a culture, we can talk about it in a moment, but it's organized around victims of oppression. It's a vertical metaphor of privileged and oppressor people and victims. And this idea that everything is power, right. It goes back a long way. I mean, students are always at risk of being told everything is power. No, everything is money. No, everything is sex. So we've had these, one-dimensional moral cultures for a long time, but they were limited to certain departments on campus at certain schools. But something began happening in 2014, 2015, where we just started hearing all these stories. Right. So when Greg and I wrote the article, it was just there were all these amazing, shocking stories of students.
What's an example of one?
Well, it's, one of the ones we tell in the paper that everyone knows. Jeannie Suk at Harvard wrote about how in her law school classes, students wouldn't let her. Students were objecting to her saying violated, like that violated the law, because violation, well, that could trigger a thought of rape. And we can't let a student who's been raped think about rape. And so, while there's a certain logic to that, it also, and this was the point of the article, the more you teach people to think that way, that hearing a trigger will reactivate, you're actually hurting them when you do that. So we're finding more and more professors saying, wait, I'm doing just what I've always done, but suddenly the students are freaking out and they're reporting me to the dean. So when we wrote the article, it was all just anecdotes.
Right.
But that was in August of 2015. That was before the big blow-up. It was really in the fall of 2015. You get the Missouri protests and then especially Yale.
Right.
So again, it's after the Yale protests that everything really spreads. And that was like 13 or 14 months ago. We are creating a survey. So at Heterodox Academy, it's a collection. We have 400 professors who've signed on to say that we think that we need viewpoint diversity. We think that no university should be politically homogeneous. We're creating a bunch of products that we think will help address these problems. And the first thing we need is good data. We're mostly social scientists. So we're creating something called the Fearless Speech Index. It's a simple survey. You come to our site, you get your own link, you send it out, and you can find out who is afraid of speaking openly, on what topics, and why. Is it because you're afraid the professor will retaliate or because other students will? So we're just pilot testing it now, but by April, we should have it up on the website. So anybody who wants to do a survey at your own school, go to heterodoxacademy.org, you'll find a link, and then you'll find out. Maybe it's that, for example, the men, what I'm finding when I talk, the men are often very quiet during my talks. They don't ask questions, they just sit there. But afterwards, they come up to me like they were, abused spouses or something. Right. Because at some schools, the men feel as though they can't speak. And then they go and vote for Trump. So the way I think about it is that there's like all these fuses coming together, and each one was burning separately to some extent. And they all intersected in the fall of 2015. And so one of them is academic trends, so the professoriate. So the professoriate has leaned left in most fields for a long time, but it only leaned left. Here's where we do have good data. From the early 90s to the late 90s is the big shift. It's as the greatest generation retires. There were a lot of Republicans in that generation, whereas the baby boomers, many of them came rushing to the academy either to avoid the Vietnam War or to study racism. So it's in the 90s that the academy goes from leaning left to being very solidly on the left. So you lose diversity there. And that's also part of why you get this faculty-driven wave of PC in the early 90s. There's all these fuses coming together. And so one is a sort of a separate evolutionary process of ideas. about power, privilege, and oppression. And that meets up with, and that's from the humanities, ideas from psychology about trauma, bullying, abuse. The idea of microaggressions was invented by a psychologist. So you get these Foucauldian ideas, you get these psychological victimhood ideas coming together.
Who came up with the microaggression?
The term goes back to the 70s or 80s, but it was popularized in an article in the American Psychologist in 2007. I think his name is Dewald Wu Sing. It's so that then the idea gets picked up. So you've got this intellectual development. The big surprise, the thing that people were not expecting, was that the students are the ones who are demanding it now. This is what took me and Greg, or took Greg by surprise, because Greg had been fighting all these speech codes, all these things imposed by administrators and faculty, and the students had always generally wanted more freedom.
Right, yeah.
But what Greg was beginning to see was that it's the students themselves who are saying, you can't say that. Stop her from saying that. We need rules to stop him from saying that. And that's what was new. A key term here is moral dependency. The most interesting idea I've come across in these years studying it is the idea of victimhood culture. There's a great paper by two sociologists, Manning and Campbell. If you go to heterodoxacademy.org and type in victimhood, you can find our abbreviated version. They analyze how many cultures used to be honor cultures, where a small insult must be attended to by you. You can't go get someone to fight your battles for you. You have your honor. Then we move to a dignity culture. As you get more trade, you don't need the honor culture anymore. In a dignity culture, sticks and stones will break my bones, names will never harm me. I'm not going to make a big deal out of a little thing. I'm just going to ignore you. And that is a great way to have diversity. If you have a diverse community, boy, do you want a dignity culture, because then the little misunderstandings, people overlook them. But what they show is that in some universities, and they're writing in 2014, before the blow-up, in some universities, those that are most egalitarian, so it's only the most left-leaning universities, where they're already egalitarian, and there's an authority who can be brought in to punish, to side. Everybody is desperately trying to get prestige by either showing what a victim they are, or by punishing people who they think have harmed victims by getting the administration to come in. So everybody is pitching to the powers that be to come in. Where did this come from? In the 80s and 90s, America changed its parenting. Kids lost unsupervised time. Kids used to have a lot of unsupervised time. You get into fights, you work it out. But because of the fear of child abduction, because of the anti-bullying policies, American child rearing changed so that there's always an adult, and the adult always solves the problems. And the whole point is you want to state your case to get the adult to punish him, and not to let him get the adult to punish me. And so kids haven't had the chance to learn to deal with insults, to learn to be excluded. I mean, we all get excluded, and you learn to deal with it. Right, people are concerned about this for generations, and I think there's no question that life in childhood has gotten more feminized, away from the masculine virtues. And in many ways, that's good. You know, I mean, there was a lot of bullying and name-calling, and so, to have a general trend that way is probably right and good and inevitable. Right. But I think it can go too far when it encourages moral dependency. Freud was wrong that everything goes back to the mother. Kids' relationships to their parents matter for attachment when they're very young. But when they're in middle school and beyond, the total obsession is the peer group. Kids have to fit into their peer group. So if these norms are peer group wide, and we should bring in social media, take whatever tribalism, groupishness, virtue signaling, take all the things that people have always done, give 13-year-olds Facebook beginning in 2006. And they're, you're really ramping up the mob punishment, the fear of saying something wrong. So the kids who entered college, so Facebook opened its policy in 2006, so the very first kids who'd been on Facebook since 13 only graduated in 2014. So professors have been encountering these kids who are just really different from the kids they were used to, who were born before 1980. And that's, I think, it's one of the threads.
Right,
there's
right.
all these threads coming together.
This is not a monocausal explanation.
No,
right?
I can give you 7 or 8. I think rather what we can say is that they have been exposed, they've been raised in a moral world that has different pillars than ours. So you and I was born in 1963, I presume you were around.
Yes, exactly.
We were raised by people who either fought World War II or at least remembered it. We were raised during the Cold War. we were raised to think that liberty and freedom were really, really important concepts. And boy, they really were. There was the free world and the not free world.
Right.
It was really clear, liberty matters. And it was American, like we are the pioneers. And what I'm noticing is that now, and actually I can show you data on this, you just do a Google Trends search. Diversity and inclusion is going up and up and up. That phrase is becoming very, very prominent. And actually even multiculturalism is going down. So diversity and inclusion is becoming primary. Our kids have been raised with such anti-bullying training. If it's Valentine's Day, everyone has to get we can't have anyone be excluded. So our kids have been raised where liberty and freedom are not really talked about. Like even China isn't, a slave country. So those liberty doesn't matter as much. Diversity and inclusion is much, much more important than we ever experienced.
And the diversity doesn't extend to say, hey, you know what, we're all different.
No.
It's not that diversity.
It's the 3 to 6 specific groups. That's what we mean by diversity. So first, it's important to realize that this is not happening at most colleges. Any college at which students come to campus, take classes, and go home, you don't get this because they're living in multiple moral worlds. If people are different ages, you don't get this. This is only at 4-year residential schools where there's a moral world that emerges as these students
this is
come
like
together.
the kids being shipwrecked in what's the
that we all read.
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies.
Thank
That's
you.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's Gilligan's Island.
That's right. Except
for
Gilligan's
a bachelor degree.
Well, yeah, it's Gilligan's Island or Lord of the Flies, but with a gigantic staff of therapists and deans around to make sure that everybody plays nice.
Right.
So it's only at the elite schools. So what do you do? Well, I think we need to rethink the way that we do diversity training. I think the way that it's often done, given that the evidence suggests diversity training either doesn't work or it can backfire if it's done with hostility.
Right.
I think we need to recognize that as a country, we are in big trouble. We face an existential threat of coming apart. And this is now obvious to everybody. And I think that we need to rethink diversity training. If you're going to have a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy, you have to get everything right. You have to look at the centrifugal forces blowing us out and the centripetal forces pulling us together. So just this morning, Kareth Foster gave a great talk on how she does diversity training. She uses humor. You got to get people to be a little lighter, give people the benefit of the doubt, recognize that diversity is difficult, and recognize that political diversity is, every year or decade, political diversity is a bigger divide. And actually, racial, we've been making progress on race and gender and sexual orientation. So a lot of the things we've been focusing on, fortunately, we're making progress. The political divide is now, I believe, the one that's going to do us in. And I think it actually might do us in. I think terrible things can happen in this country. Many analysts I've read and spoken to agree, Trump is very much a symptom of what was happening. He could not have come in had we not had such dysfunction, animosity, distrust, cynicism. And then Trump is making those worse by violating what were the norms. So we are in big trouble, and we will still be in big trouble once Trump leaves. So I think we need to rethink this. And I think a lot of ideas from sort of mid to late 20th century America, Richard Rorty's ideas have been kicking around, Arthur Schlesinger, about having a common in-group identity, a shared identity. This is basic social psychology. The more you emphasize differences, the more you drive people apart. So there's an active discussion now about nationalism and patriotism. And before Trump was elected, back when we all thought Hillary was going to win, I wrote 2 essays earlier this year on nationalism, what we're seeing around the world now is the left-right divide has become the nationalist, the left is the globalist versus the nationalist.
Right.
So this is very much in Europe, it's in a number of countries. And I've been trying to say, because the left tends to reject nationalism, reject patriotism, reject borders, that this is a losing path. You're not going to win elections. You can't even run a country like that. I've been trying to define healthy, positive forms of nationalism and patriotism. And for America, it should be easy because it's not racial at all. So America should be really good at doing this, and Britain should be pretty good too. And then Trump comes along, and the first thing he says in his inaugural address is this like ugly, it's almost a blood and soil patriotism. I was hoping that he was going to say something like, I've said a lot of things about illegal immigration in this country, but boy, if you came here legally and you're a citizen and you're Mexican, I love you. I'm your president. I was hoping he was going to say that, and he could have. But now he's made, just as he's making, PC is his issue, which makes it harder for me to criticize PC. Now he's made patriotism his issue, which makes it harder for me to say patriotism is good.
It's like he's got your number. He must be hacking your computer or something. But
I'm not sure that it affects the campus climate so much right now, but I think it's likely to lead to a huge disruption at some point in the next 10, 15 years. So, if you go back, 5 years before any of this, the intense, PC stuff was happening, once MOOCs started coming out and the cost of college was such an issue, a lot of people were saying it's just a matter of time before there's a big disruption. If college is not delivering the value, if there are alternatives, it's just a matter of time before most schools go out of business. Harvard and Yale, Chicago, Stanford, they'll always be there, but most schools will go out of business. And I think what's happened is as college has gotten weirder and weirder and all this bad publicity, most people in the country look at the coddling culture, they look at the students protesting, and they're not sympathetic. Many of them are horrified. So I think that's a black mark on colleges. And what are they doing to deal with it? A lot of the things that the elite schools are doing to deal with the protests are hiring a lot more administrators, having a lot more expensive programs. So I think they're kind of digging in their own grave a little faster. They're speeding up the time of the disruption. As soon as someone can come up with a way of actually training or certifying people so that they can actually get jobs, I think colleges are going to face a big loss of market share. It's sort of the classical things that we say, about the liberal arts and liberal arts education are just what we need now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my wife went to Smith as an undergrad. She loved it. She loved literature. So she went to the University of Virginia to get a master's degree, thinking that she loves literature, let me go study literature. And she was so disappointed because it was really more about politics and power and Foucault type. I mean, it wasn't about literature. It wasn't liberal arts thinking. It was very ideological. Yeah. So, I think the humanities have kind of lost credit, and I think it's their own fault.